You want to understand these big, complex things, and you want it all laid out, like, efficiently.
Yeah.
No time for wading through a bunch of fluff, right?
Straight to the point.
Yeah, straight to the point. So that's what we're doing today. We're going to dive deep into World War I.
100 years ago.
100 years before this recording, actually.
Yeah.
From summer 1914 to November 1918.
And it was, well, a global catastrophe when you think about it. Nearly 70 million people were involved across the world. And the deaths, something like 18 million people died.
That's a huge number.
And almost half of those, it's important to remember, were civilians. So this war really reached beyond the battlefield, you know?
Absolutely. And that sort of leads to the big question, the question we're going to try to answer in this deep dive. And that's why? Why did this happen? Why a war of this scale? What were the kind of like the underlying currents, the tensions that were brewing that made it not just possible, but maybe even kind of inevitable?
Yep.
And we're going to be going through a really interesting YouTube transcript which sort of lays out the history here. So, yeah, where do we even begin? What was it about Europe in the lead up to 1914 that made it such a tinderbox, I guess?
Well, you've got, I mean, Europe has a long history of warfare between smaller nations, like continuous warfare. And over time, that actually kind of led to bigger powers, more centralized powers emerging. So we're talking Great Britain, France, Italy, the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans, Russia. You know, it's important to remember, those are the names from 100 years ago. The map's a little bit different today.
Yeah, of course, right.
And so you have the centralization, which maybe brings stability for periods, but it means that when conflict erupts, it's on a much larger scale, across wider territory.
Yeah, so it wasn't like a happy little continent, everybody coexisting peacefully.
Not exactly, no. There were these inherent conflicts, and often these conflicts were about territory, about, you know, things that bordered each other. But even without borders, there were some real rivalries brewing.
And I mean, I guess some of the big ones that come to mind are like Britain, France, Germany.
Exactly. They had these powerful navies, which both symbolized and enabled their global reach. And they were all competing for colonies, particularly in Africa. And we have to remember, this is also the time of the Second Industrial Revolution. So Britain, France, Germany, they're industrializing like crazy. And they see Africa as this like source of all this raw material, this place that they can sell all these manufactured goods. So it's a real scramble for Africa.
Yeah, like carving up a whole continent. It's hard to imagine the audacity of it now. But I remember reading about how arbitrary some of these borders were. Like the British were just kind of drawing lines kind of randomly. The French were doing it horizontally. The Germans were trying to get their own like diagonal slices. You know, it just seems like it was bound to create clashes, all these colonial ambitions.
Oh, it absolutely did. And it was a major source of tension between these countries. But Germany in particular had a particular anxiety, which was this idea of a two-front war. And this wasn't just like a theoretical concern. This really shaped their military thinking, ultimately leading to things like the Schlieffen Plan, which we'll get into. You know, it's a great insight into how perceived vulnerability can drive aggressive action.
Right, right. So you've got like France to the west, who they've had issues with in the past, and then you've got this huge expansionist Russia to the east. I mean, that's a tough spot to be in strategically.
Absolutely. And so what Germany initially tries to do is they try to forge a non-aggression pact with Russia, right? They want to neutralize that front in case something happens with France. They also form the Triple Alliance, first with Austria, Hungary, and then initially Russia, but Russia kind of increasingly goes its own way. And then Italy steps in. So you've got the Triple Alliance. And all of this while Germany is experiencing this incredible industrial growth thanks to the Second Industrial Revolution. I mean, electricity, oil, wireless technology, the internal combustion engine, the automobile, the airplane, refrigerators, telephones, all these innovations are happening. And Germany is just becoming this powerhouse.
So Germany's going through this huge, huge transformation, industrial transformation. What was Russia's role in all of this?
Yeah.
It sounds like they were pretty active in this sort of this shifting political landscape, particularly down in the Balkans.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating here is how Russia's actions, especially within the declining Ottoman Empire, are causing a lot of concern. The Ottoman Empire, much bigger than Turkey today, is experiencing a lot of internal unrest. Different ethnic groups are trying to assert themselves. And Russia, under this banner of supporting, fellow Slavs, Orthodox Christians who want independence, they're basically helping to fragment the empire. And they're not shy about, exerting their influence, filling that power vacuum.
Right, so you've got new nations like Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, all popping up. And they're often seen as being within Russia's sphere of influence, which
Mhm.
I imagine is causing some anxiety in Vienna and Berlin.
Absolutely. And, this westward expansion of Russia, even if it's framed as support for, cultural brethren, it's seen as a direct threat,
Yeah.
particularly by Austria-Hungary, which, itself has a lot of Slavic populations within its borders. And this really comes to a head at the Congress of Berlin in 1878. This is where the major European powers come together and essentially try to put a stop to further Russian expansion westward. Russia agrees, but they feel really betrayed, especially by Germany, who they felt did not support their ambitions.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I could see how, from Russia's perspective, they would see Germany as kind of going back on their word, considering that earlier non-aggression pact. It's a pretty clear illustration of how quickly things can shift in this game of, like, great power politics, like alliances, interests, they're not set in stone.
Exactly. And Germany, knowing how upset Russia is, they quickly moved to strengthen their alliance with Austria-Hungary. So it goes from, neutrality in case of an attack to a full-blown mutual defense pact, specifically targeting Russia, and then to further solidify their position.
Italy joins the party.
Italy joins the party, exactly, forming the Triple Alliance. But why Italy? It does seem a little bit like out of
It
place.
does,
It's
yeah.
a classic enemy of my enemy is my friend scenario. They had a really bad relationship with France at the time, competing colonial ambitions in North Africa, some lingering territorial disputes, and so aligning with Germany and Austria-Hungary was a way to, counterbalance French influence.
Okay, so by the late 1800s, we've got this really intricate web of tensions brewing across Europe. You've got colonial competition, the balance of power shifting because of this rapid industrialization, and these alliances that are getting like more and more rigid. So is there anything at all that was kind of keeping the peace, however tenuously, during this period?
Well, I mean, the colonial expansion continued, but, with more and more friction. And there were some close calls, some crises, but, things were diffused. Britain, of course, had this vast empire. India, Australia, South Africa. Germany had acquired some colonies, smaller, but, in Africa, Qingdao in China, New Guinea. And France had a huge chunk of Africa and Indochina. And the race to secure raw materials, to find new markets for all their industrial output, that was still driving this expansion. But it's also creating more chances for things to go wrong.
And France was, I mean, they were getting pretty nervous about Germany's like meteoric rise,
Right.
right? Both industrially and territorially.
Oh, absolutely. Germany's just growing too fast for their liking. And so, seeking security, they formed a secret alliance with Russia, a mutual defense pact against German expansion, pretty straightforward. And interestingly, France also made a secret agreement with Italy.
Another secret deal.
Yeah.
This is getting complicated. What was this one about?
So, this agreement essentially said that Italy would remain neutral if Germany and France went to war. Which, really shows you how complex these alliances were, right? They're
Mhm.
often based on like very immediate, very specific conflicts of interest. Italy, even though they're in the Triple Alliance with Austria-Hungary, they've still got their own issues with them, territorial disputes. So making a deal with France, it's a pretty smart hedge.
And Great Britain, they weren't exactly comfortable with Germany's, growing influence either, right?
Hmm.
I remember something about a pretty big infrastructure project that they were worried about.
Yeah, the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. It was this ambitious plan to link Germany via its allies in the Ottoman Empire all the way down to the oil-rich areas of Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. And Britain, which has their own big stake in Middle Eastern oil, saw this railway as a direct challenge, a potential lifeline for Germany that could undermine British dominance.
So, I mean, if you cut through all the rhetoric, all the nationalistic fervor, it really does seem like the core drivers of this conflict were, pretty tangible things. Land, resources.
Absolutely. It was really about territorial and resource disputes driven by these national ambitions for development and power. It wasn't really about these big ideological clashes. But under it all, there was this real fear, a constant anxiety among all these European nations that they could be attacked at any moment. And, after centuries of conflict, it's no surprise they felt that way.
Right, and it's this environment that leads to the formation of these two big, rigid power blocks.
Exactly. You've got the Entente, Great Britain, France, Russia, increasingly aligned against the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and, formally Italy, though that's going to change. And then in the background, you've got the weakening Ottoman Empire. They're facing all this internal unrest. They've lost territory. Most recently, Bosnia, annexed by Austria-Hungary, which just adds more fuel to the fire down in the Balkans.
And that brings us to Sarajevo, the the spark that ignites this tinderbox.
Right, Bosnia was this major flashpoint, largely Serbian population, territory that independent Serbia wanted for themselves, this dream of a united Serbian state. And then on June 28, 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne, and his wife, Sophie, they're assassinated in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist.
So a single brutal act with truly global repercussions. What happens immediately after? Like, what's the chain reaction here?
Well, Austria-Hungary is understandably furious. They see this as a direct attack on their sovereignty, especially given the assassin's ties to Serbian nationalism. So they issue this really harsh ultimatum to Serbia, making all these demands, including the right to have Austro-Hungarian officials participate in the investigation on Serbian soil.
And Serbia, feeling like they've got Russia's backing, I mean, they didn't exactly, like, roll over and comply with everything, did they?
No. They agreed to some things, but anything they felt infringed on their sovereignty, they rejected. Particularly that whole idea of letting Austro-Hungarian officials onto their territory. And Austria-Hungary, they've got Germany backing them up. They see this as a rejection, their excuse to act.
So any attempt at diplomacy, at de-escalation, that just all goes out the window.
Completely. On July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. It's that first domino falling.
And all the other powers, they get pulled in pretty quickly, right?
Mm-hmm.
Russia mobilizes to support Serbia, and, well, that sets off alarm bells in Germany.
Exactly. Germany sees Russia mobilizing. They take that as a direct threat. So they issue ultimatums to Russia demanding, they demobilize to France demanding neutrality. They don't get the responses they want. So they declare war on Russia, and fearing that two-front war, they also declare war on France.
And Germany had this very specific plan for dealing with this possibility, right? The Schlieffen Plan.
Yeah. Their whole strategy was based on the Schlieffen Plan. The idea was to quickly knock France out of the war in the West within weeks and then turn around, deal with Russia in the East, who they figured would take longer to mobilize. The key to this plan was to bypass France's heavy defenses on the border by going through Belgium, a gamble, relying on a quick victory in the West.
But that decision to go through neutral Belgium, that had huge consequences. It brought another major power into the conflict.
Huge consequences. Great Britain, they had this treaty obligation to protect Belgian neutrality, and they saw the German invasion as a clear violation of international law. So they give Germany an ultimatum, get out of Belgium or else. Germany doesn't budge, so Britain declares war. They join France and Belgium against Germany.
So in the space of a few days, you go from this localized conflict in the Balkans to a full-blown European war. All because of these alliances, these rivalries, this whole complex web of commitments. And even Italy, who is technically part of the Triple Alliance, they decide to sit this one out initially.
Right. They declare neutrality, saying that their Triple Alliance obligations were defensive only and that Austria-Hungary was the aggressor. Plus, they had that secret agreement with France. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Russia actually has some early successes against Austria-Hungary.
And the nature of war itself, it's changing really rapidly, right? It's not just armies clashing on the battlefield anymore.
It's a whole new kind of war. It expands to the seas, even the air. Britain, with its powerful navy, they impose a blockade on Germany, trying to strangle their economy. Germany retaliates with their U-boats. And then you have, for the first time, air power playing a significant role.
Zeppelins bombing London. I mean, that's got to be terrifying.
It was. They were first used for reconnaissance, but then they started bombing civilian targets in Britain. And it really becomes a total war. It's not just the armies fighting, it's whole societies mobilized. Industries repurposed, colonies are brought in, providing resources, manpower. It's a global effort.
And then the war bogs down into this bloody stalemate, years of trench warfare, horrific casualties.
Yeah.
But there were some key turning points, right? Like the U.S. entering the war.
Oh, yeah, huge turning point. Initially, the U.S. is neutral. They've got this strong isolationist streak. But a few things happen that start to change public opinion, and one of the biggest is the sinking of the Lusitania.
The Lusitania, that was just horrific. Hundreds of civilians, including Americans, killed.
Almost 1,200 people died, 198 Americans among them. It was a British passenger liner sailing from New York to Liverpool, and there were claims that it was carrying war materials, but still, the loss of civilian life, it caused outrage in the U.S. Germany had issued warnings to neutral ships, but the sinking was seen as this barbaric act. And, along with their unrestricted submarine warfare, it really eroded support for neutrality in America. So they start preparing for war secretly, and then around the same time.
Italy jumps into the fray, but not on the side you might expect.
Right. They see how things are unfolding. They've got their own designs on Austrian territory, and so they decide to join the Entente, declaring war on Austria-Hungary in May 1915. Public opinion in Italy had also turned against Germany and Austria-Hungary, and the promise of territorial gains, well, that was a powerful motivator. Meanwhile, Britain was busy pursuing its own objectives in the Middle East.
Trying to dismantle the Ottoman Empire, secure their own interests.
Exactly. They're having these secret talks with France and other allies about how they're going to carve up the Ottoman Empire after the war. They're also working with Arab nationalists within the Ottoman Empire, promising them support independence if they revolt against the Ottomans.
So by 1917, the whole global picture of the war had shifted. But the Western Front, it's still this bloody stalemate.
Yeah, new technologies, tanks, better artillery, machine guns, they all lead to these horrific losses. But neither side can really break through. Everyone's getting exhausted. And Germany, they're especially hit hard by the British blockade. Shortages of food, supplies. The Entente, on the other hand, they're getting more and more support from the U.S. And then there's another big turning point.
The Zimmermann telegram. It sounds like something out of a spy novel.
It does, right? So in January 1917, the U.S. is still officially neutral, and the German Foreign Office sends this secret telegram to their ambassador in Mexico. The proposal is, if the U.S. joins the war against Germany, Mexico should join Germany's side. In return, Germany will help them get back the territories they lost to the U.S. in the 1800s, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona.
A bold move, but didn't really work out so well.
No, not at all. British intelligence intercepted the telegram, decoded it, and shared it with the U.S. And when word of this secret German plan got out, well, you can imagine the outrage in America. It really pushed them closer to war. And almost at the same time, you have this massive upheaval in Russia.
The Russian Revolution. I mean, years of war, economic hardship, social unrest, it all just boiled over.
It did. In February 1917, the Tsar is forced to abdicate, and a provisional government takes over. But they decide to stay in the war, which makes people even angrier. And then, just a few months later, the Bolsheviks seize power, led by Lenin. And they're dealing with their own internal problems, a civil war, so they pull Russia out of World War I.
So Germany gets a bit of breathing room in the East, but now they've got this new, powerful enemy to worry about in the West.
Exactly. And while Russia's imploding, the Entente's making progress elsewhere. The British, Greeks, Serbians, they're pushing back against Austria-Hungary in the Balkans. And Austria-Hungary itself, it's starting to come apart at the seams, all these different ethnic groups wanting independence. And so by November 1918,
Austria-Hungary's done.
they're done. They've lost the war, their empire's falling apart, so they sign an armistice with the Entente. And Germany, they see their main ally collapse. They've got mutinies in their navy. People back home are demanding peace. It's clear they can't win. So the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, abdicates, and on November 11th, 1918, they sign an armistice with the Entente. World War I is over.
But the end of the fighting, that doesn't mean the end of the turmoil. In fact, the Treaty of Versailles, which was supposed to bring peace, it kind of set the stage for more conflict down the road, didn't it?
Right. It did. You've got the Paris Peace Conference, dominated by the victors, Great Britain, France, the U.S., Italy, Japan. They're the ones calling the shots, deciding the fate of the losers. Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans. The smaller countries, they don't have much say. And the treaty they come up with, the Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, 5 years to the day after the assassination in Sarajevo, it's brutal, especially towards Germany. And what's important here is that it's not just that it's harsh, it's that it creates this deep sense of humiliation in Germany, and that, as history shows, rarely leads to lasting peace.
Brutal is putting it mildly. They basically blamed Germany for the whole thing and slapped them with this huge bill.
Full responsibility for the war, all the damage, all of it on Germany. They lose a ton of territory, about 20% of what they had before the war. Important industrial areas, resource-rich regions, the Saarland, Alsace-Lorraine, they're either given to the Allies or back to France. And the reparations, they're massive. 132 billion gold marks, which in today's money is trillions of dollars. Germany didn't finish paying them off until 2010.
92 years. I mean, that's got to cripple an economy.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the money, was it?
No, they also lose all their colonies, which get divided up among the victors. Their military severely restricted, limits on the size of their army, their navy, their air force. And then there's Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. They're completely dismantled. Austria-Hungary is broken up into several new countries: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, which itself will later break up even more. The Ottoman Empire, well, that becomes modern-day Turkey, and then you've got these mandates in the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, controlled by France and Britain. Eventually, they'll lead to the independence of some Arab states, but not all. Some of the promises made during the war weren't kept.
So the map of Europe, the Middle East, it's completely redrawn. And it wasn't just the treaties that ended the war, right? There were other things going on.
Right, you had these internal revolutions, unrest contributing to the collapse of some of these empires. And then there was the Spanish flu pandemic. It hit at the end of the war and actually killed way more people than the war itself, maybe as many as 100 million worldwide. It was just this devastating global health crisis on top of everything else.
What a terrible time.
Yeah.
And the long-term consequences, they were huge.
Oh, yeah. Europe's economy was in ruins, and for most countries, it was a long, slow recovery. Except for the US, they actually came out of it stronger economically. But in Germany, that resentment from the Treaty of Versailles, it festered, it created this breeding ground for extremism, and it definitely contributed to future conflicts. And the human cost, millions dead on both sides, it scarred a generation, left Europe vulnerable.
It's a pretty grim picture.
Huh.
But there was one remarkable moment during the war, this unexpected moment of humanity, right? The Christmas truce.
Yeah, it's a really incredible story. December 1914, the fighting on the Western Front is intense. And then on Christmas Day, you have this spontaneous, unofficial ceasefire. It starts with the Germans. They come out of their trenches, calling out Christmas greetings, holding up Christmas trees.
I mean, given the situation, I imagine there was a lot of suspicion at first.
Yeah, of course. But then something amazing happens. Soldiers from both sides, they start cautiously coming out of their trenches, meeting in no man's land. They're exchanging gifts, sharing food, cigarettes. There are even reports and photographs of them playing football together. Apparently, the Germans won 3-2. It's hard to believe, right? This moment of shared humanity in the middle of this horrific war. It really makes you think about the individual stories, the human side of things that gets lost in the big picture.
It really does. This brief moment of peace, it shows that there wasn't this inherent hatred between the soldiers themselves. They were just ordinary people caught up in this extraordinary situation.
Absolutely. They were all just human beings. But unfortunately, it didn't last. The commanders on both sides, they shut it down pretty quickly, and the soldiers had to go back to fighting. And the war went on for another 4 long years.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into World War I, what's a big takeaway for you?
Well, World War I was this incredibly complex event with roots going back decades. This tangled web of national rivalries, imperial ambitions, these rigid alliances that ultimately backfired. The assassination in Sarajevo was the spark, but the tinder was already there, waiting to be ignited.
And the consequences, they were huge. They reshaped the world politically. And, like we talked about, it created the conditions for future conflicts. The human cost, it's just a reminder of how devastating these large-scale wars are. But that story of the Christmas truce, it's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's still this spark of humanity.
It really makes you think, right? All that suffering, so many unintended consequences, it makes you question things. What can we learn from this? About nationalism, about military buildups, about how dangerous those things can be? How does this relate to what's happening in the world today? How do countries interact? What happens when they pursue their own interests? And, what responsibility do we have to understand history to try to prevent this from happening again? It's a lot to think about.
It is.
A lot to think about.
And on that note, we're going to wrap things up for today.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
And hopefully we'll see you next time.
See you next time.